Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to see everybody this morning. And we heard two wonderful speakers sort of framing the conversation. Our task with this panel, this first panel, is to sort of lay out the big context of what's going on, the status of the U.S. Korea economic relationship, and then looking forward, what are those areas that need to be addressed? Just to offer just an opening comment, we know this region is undergoing very dynamic change across the Indo-Pacific, both in the security arena and in the economic arena. And the question is, what can the U.S. and Korea do together broadly? I think the Minister Tae-ho Lee framed this very nicely in general terms. But my hope is that as we look at this, how do we view the strengths and build off the strengths of the trade agreement? What can we do to further promote investment? And how do we set high standards, not only that we two countries adhere to, but how do we export those standards more broadly throughout the region? We have a very distinguished panel here to open this discussion. The way we will proceed is that we will have a Korean presentation, a U.S. presentation, and then we'll have a Korean discussant to respond, followed by a U.S. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Chae Byung-il, and Dr. Chae is a very distinguished professor at the Graduate School of International Studies, Ewha Women's University. He will be our Korean discussant. From the U.S. perspective, we have Joy Yamamoto, Director of the Office of Korean Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. She will give the U.S. perspective. And then the discussion will follow with Chul Chung, Senior Vice President, Korea Institute for International Economic Policy, followed by David Gussack, the Vice President for Asia, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So with that, I think what we'll do is we'll start with our Korean presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bustani. Before I begin, I'd like to share with you my memory of the late President George W. Bush. Yesterday was his funeral. When I was studying at Yale, New Haven, 1988, so more than 30-some years ago, I think it's right after elections, he was elected next president of the U.S. at the time. And Life magazine, they sent a photo shooting team to Yale campus because, if I recall correctly, the President Bush, right after serving his military in Second World War II, he returned to Yale, and he used to leave the same office where I was using as TA office. So I think that is some sort of, the very interesting beginning of my careers and having some common thread between U.S. Korea Economic Alliance. Well, this morning, I'm so glad to be back to Washington because I was the very first moderator of this session back in Seoul, 2017, and Joy was at the same sessions. Back then, she was working in Seoul. So this morning, I'm going to set out three issues. I'll start with my assessment of current status of Korea-U.S. economic alliance or relationship. We'll start with my own assessment and prospect for KORUS. And also, I'd like to share with you my own assessment of economic alliance in the era of so-called new normal. New normal, I mean traditional thinking of security on one side and trade on the other side. I think that demarcation line has long gone. So how are we going to manage economic alliance in the era of new normal? And finally, perhaps I think pursuant to moderate suggestions, I will suggest some three key areas where Korea-U.S. can work together for the future. Well, Vice Minister Lee, he shared with you his assessment of prospect KORUS FTA in Seoul. He said perhaps as early as tomorrow or pretty soon, Korean National Assembly, they're going to introduce plenary sessions they're going to approve, renegotiate, and amended KORUS trade agreement. That's quite surprising development because as a Korean trade expert who have seen through thick and thin of KORUS FTA in past several years, especially when current government, when they were in opposition party, they had so much issues in relation to ISDS, Invest-State Dispute Settlement. But if you look at current KORUS FTA as amended, it doesn't say anything too much from Korean point of view, ISDS, especially when you compare with newly negotiated NAFTA 2.0, which is being called USMCA in these regions. In USMCA, as far as I can see, between US and Canada, this ISDS is going to phase out after 3 years. So I think that is going to be very, very interesting discrepancy between KORUS FTA and USMCA. And it's quite surprising because I don't see any angry voice from Korean NGOs on this issue. So it's quite surprising development. The reason I'm bringing this issue to you is even though Korean politics may give co-sign and blessing to KORUS, but I'm not going to be surprised somehow in the futures, perhaps within a few years, this KORUS issue may be rebrought in the table. Then I think it is going to be something quite bizarre. At the same time, it's going to be very, very embarrassing. And so, even though KORUS may be given green light in Korean side, I think you should be cautioned. Another issue is even though KORUS renegotiation played a very important role of dealing with reducing uncertainty, hanging over, but I think in the Korean side, they're giving some blind trust to the healthy maintenance of Korea-U.S. alliance, because we have a very strategic discussion. Is it wise and clever to go ahead and ratify, or should we delay? Because the reason I'm telling you this is in the USA, especially current administrations, they are dealing with this economic issues using security weapons, which I call Section 232. This is my second point. Section 232, to many eyes of Korean observers, including myself, this is major and shocking development. Because when U.S. administration early this year, they tried to levy 25% tariff on steel and 10% aluminum by invoking Section 232 relating to 1962 Trade Expansion Act. Before President Trump was making final determination actions, according to proposal recommendations as prepared by Department of Commerce, it has a Plan B. According to Plan B, they designated 12 countries, so-called 12 terrible countries, which is giving so much damage to U.S. Their judgment was, if we're going to import steel from those countries, we're in position of compromising on national security. And you had, the usual suspect like China's and Russia's. But to my great surprise, South Korea was in one of those 12 countries. To me, this was shocking. This may relate to some limitation of Korean diplomacy at one point, but I think that's related to some perceptions, maybe not factors, hard effect. Perceptions forged by current policymakers here in Washington. I think if this is going to be continued, this is going to pose major challenge for us to address and deal with. Even though this Plan B was not implemented, and Korea negotiated a tariff instead of tariff, quota, so 70% quota. And but right now, as we speak, still clouds hanging over a possibility of invoking Section 232 in automobile. I think compared with steel, Section 232 possible 25% tariff on automobile is going to be a major earthquake. So if that happens, even the Korean government, they will be in position of ratifying KORUS FTA as renegotiated. I think we will be throwing into major crisis. So this should be more effectively and cleverly managed. And I will turn into 3 areas for common endeavor between the 2 countries. If I tell you those list, first of all, I think Korea and U.S., we should fight together against unfair trade practice, trade policy. And second, WTO reform is one thing 2 countries should work together. And last but not the least, some common work in relation to digital trade. I think this is along the line of Vice Minister Lee mentioned digital single initiative. So I'll explain one by one why we have to do this and what can be done, and I will sum up with some possible proposals. What I mean by fight against unfair trade practice, or basically what I have in my mind is my big neighboring country, which is China. Korea is still in the midst of going through their trade retaliation in relation to deployment of THAADs. The sanction has not finished, despite the assurance. I think this is classic case of China is using geoeconomics. So they are dealing with security issues using their economic issues. And also Korea is a major victim of Made in China 2025, because Korea and all these major investment, petrochemicals, electrical batteries, and semiconductors, one and after others, they're under heavy scrutiny of Chinese government. So Korea need to work together with the USA, how we can effectively deal with techno-nationalism, which is going to be very unfair industrial policy, and also how we can work together with to overcome digital fortress, sometimes known as Great Firewall of China, because this is totally anti-competitive. And last but not least, we need to work together with China's very essence of non-market economy status. But for your information, Korean government, back in 2005, we accorded market economy status China, because our underlying assumption at the time was China will continue to reform often further. And in order to deal with North Korean issues, Korean government gave some good faith gestures, market economy status, but that assumption has not fulfilled. So that is some useful information. And for WTO reform, I think this is some very serious issues, because we all understand the global economy, especially South Korea, we're given tremendous benefit because of rule-based free trading system. But in past 10 years, at least WTO has not been working. It ceased to function effectively. It couldn't create any momentum in terms of further market opening liberalizations. And also its surveillance monitoring system is not effective. And its ruled dispute resolution system is not working. So all this is some very disastrous. If we're not going to fix this problem as soon as possible, what's going to happen is WTO is going to be virtually not functioning, and all major countries, they're going to bypass WTO, and that is going to be at the mercy of big and powerful economy, which is going to do detriment of Korean economy. So for WTO reform, I think the 2 major issues. One is state-owned enterprise. Again, this is related to Chinese economy. The second one is a subsidy. Because of so much unfair subsidy, not only anti-competitive, but dealing with foreign companies which is make investment in those countries in unfair, unduly way. So we need to work with. But the problem, as I see, is this is going to be very tough issues. And unless we're going to work in tandem in a very concerted way, challenge is going to be so big, and our effort may fall short. And that is related to my proposal, because current U.S. administrations, they're dealing with WTO reform issues, sort of single-handed issues, without relying on so much, the coalition buildings. And it seems to me the current administration of U.S., they tend to believe its own unilateral powers. I think that is not going to be clever. So in these WTO reform areas, we need to work together and come up with very effective, decisive strategies which can take you all the way through. And finally, I will share my proposal on this digital trade, because we talk about all this digital economy, digital transformations, which is known as in Korean Peninsula, East Asia's fourth industrial revolutions. We all talk Korea is having a wonderful infrastructures, and I myself, I was one of those agent change back in 1990. I was working for Korean transformations when I was working with trade negotiators in Korea-U.S. telecom and so on. Back then, what was happening was Korean government was using effectively foreign market opening pressures, take it into some forces of reviewing itself and reform its regulatory system. So Korea was very Cinderella stories, and they helped to Korea's rise to IT powers in the 1990s. But it's very unfortunate for me to say to you, despite Korea's remarkable, wonderful physical infrastructures, but because of what was happening after since, so much fragmented, burdensome regulation in privacies and data protections, I think we still at the status too much potential, but fail to make most of our ITC infrastructure so that we can soar into great economies in digital transformations. I think this is where our common endeavor should play in, because as I see it, in this world, we have three models in competitions in digital trade. One is U.S. model, very much supply-driven, pro-business-driven, and benefit of doubt is given to competition, so let it try, and if there's problem, we're going to fix it. That's our attitude. Very pro-supplier-driven. And at the other extreme, you have EU model, because EU doesn't have any major suppliers. The whole concern is to protect consumer privacy and so on. And we are China model. China model, first of all, they deny competition. They busy protect and promote the national champion, but they believe in the market size, so they're going to isolate themselves from competitions, and they believe in the system. So if you don't have any effective global common endeavor, at the end of the day, we'll have three fragmented systems in digital trade, which should be connectivity. So connectivity is going to be not global connectivity. And this is where my proposal about U.S. Korea possible endeavors in forging common response to digital trade. So this is my proposal to you, and I look forward to your feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Joy?
Good morning. It's an honor to address you today on, regarding, it's an honor to address you today regarding critical issues underlying this, this discussion. It's a special honor since I spoke a year ago in Seoul at the first public-private economic forum, and I'm delighted and grateful to KEI and our Korean partners that this is a second forum. I'm hoping that my remarks this morning will paint a hopeful picture of where the U.S.-ROK economic relationship is, and more importantly, where I believe it can and should be headed. I hope that you come away from today's discussion sensing the optimism that I feel about the future of U.S.-Korean economic cooperation. Together, our nations have achieved much since our predecessors forged our alliance some 65 years ago. Our relationship is built on a solid foundation of security issues arising from the Korean War, but over the years we've expanded, we have deepened this alliance. We've learned that our relationship works best when both our economies are vibrant, resilient, and healthy. I can state confidently that the U.S. government is committed to strengthening this relationship as we and our Korean allies work in tandem in the pursuit of sustainable, balanced, and inclusive economic growth, just as we work together to increase our mutual prosperity and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region and the world. First, as we appraise our bilateral relationship, our bilateral economic relationship today, I think it's important and encouraging to reflect on Korea's stunning economic achievements after it emerged from the devastation of the Korean War. Once a recipient of foreign aid, Korea now funds economic growth in nations around the world, most notably in Southeast Asia and Africa. Over the course of 6 decades, this economic advance transformed one of the world's poorest nations into a thriving center of advanced manufacturing, internet connectivity, and cutting-edge technologies. But this is not where the story ends. One of the unique and to outside observers most fascinating characteristics about Korea is a constant undercurrent of economic anxiety, even when things are going well. This likely explains why the spirit that inspired this miracle of the Han stays alive. The determination and push to always improve and do better is what defines modern Korea, and it is one reason why the country remains a widely admired symbol of success. That determination to achieve great things also helps explain why in Korea today you find operations of more than 1,200 American companies, including such flagship enterprises as Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook. Seoul plays host to the first Google campus in Asia. On the other side, Korean firms have invested more than $40 billion in the United States, the second largest Asian source of investment in my country. The ROC remains our 6th largest trading partner, accounting for more than $155 billion in two-way trade in goods and services last year. The basis for this vibrant economic relationship is the 6-year-old U.S. Korea Free Trade Agreement, or KORUS. In the past year, our governments worked to update and strengthen the agreement, and in September, President Moon and President Trump reaffirmed the importance of maintaining strong, mutually beneficial trade and economic ties between our peoples when they signed the agreement in New York. As President Moon said, quote, "Through this agreement, I hope that the bilateral economic ties that will be promoted even further." It's testament to our longstanding partnership that we could work together to revise KORUS, making it even more mutually beneficial. So it's in this context that we are taking our bilateral relationship to the next level by leveraging our dynamic and proven bilateral cooperation in a quest to solve even bigger issues on the world stage. These challenges include combating infectious diseases, improving air quality, and preserving our oceans. In doing so, I expect Korea and America will continue to build on our shared values and our country's commitments to democracy, free and open commerce, and protection of human rights. These shared values drive our alliance and our efforts to surmount challenges and create a better world, challenges including combating terrorism, eradicating poverty, and ensuring energy and health security. Just look at the impact in the Indo-Pacific region. The region's secure environment has facilitated tremendous economic growth, prosperity, and peace, and it was made possible in large part by the rules-based economic regional architecture in which the U.S.-Korean alliance has played a central role. Through our combined efforts involving allies, friends, and partners in the region, we are helping to maintain the security and stability that's needed to ensure continuing peace and prosperity. We can do so largely because Korea continues to exercise its role as a regional and global leader, including as a member of key multilateral bodies such as the G20. This leadership gives both countries the opportunity to support each other's efforts to promote a rules-based international order. As leaders in high technology, we can focus greater attention and resources on bringing more women into the tech industry. Together, we can close the digital divide and help equalize access to modern information and communications technologies by the world's people, regardless of gender, income, age, and geography. Moreover, we can be leaders in the fourth industrial revolution and formulate innovations that benefit all mankind, from smart and zero-emission cars to next-generation robots and to the remote delivery of health care services. These things can happen when the business environment stimulates innovation and inspires young people to take innovation from concept to fruition. Innovation cannot flourish in an environment where rules, regulations, and other types of interference are used to shield homegrown companies from foreign competition. From our Korean allies, we need a more coherent and predictable regulatory environment that is better aligned with international standards. We recognize the need to protect consumers and intellectual property rights, but there should be no room for Korea-unique standards designed to keep competition at bay. President Moon has highlighted this need for Korea as he has described Korea's full participation in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. He has identified regulatory redesign as key to innovation-based growth and to enhance Korea's competitiveness in the global economy. Only by adopting truly global standards in such fields as ICT, financial services, and manufacturing can we arm Korean and American entrepreneurs with the tools to compete in each other's markets and anywhere in the world. Let me close by noting a timely example of collaboration between our two governments. Tomorrow morning, the State Department and the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs will host the Senior Economic Dialogue, to be chaired by Acting Undersecretary Manisha Singh and Vice Minister Lee Tae-ho. This dialogue is a way for our two countries to talk openly and in detail about our evolving economic relationship, as well as to look for ways to overcome some of the biggest challenges that restrain economic development, security, and well-being in the rest of the world. We will look for ways to improve our partnership between the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy and the ROC's new Southern Policy to deepen cooperation in the region. Just over a year ago, Presidents Trump and Moon, during their first summit meeting, launched a new partnership in energy security, health, and women's economic empowerment. The Senior Economic Dialogue will work to advance those priorities too. Thank you again for the opportunity to address this group today. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Joy. So we've heard from our Korean and U.S. presenters. Now we'll go to the discussants, and we'll start with Chol Chung.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bustani. I'd like to thank Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea and U.S. Department of State and the KEI for organizing this wonderful event. Personally, coming from KIAP, I am very glad to have Ambassador Kathleen Stevens as the President and CEO of KEI. I look forward to working together, 같이. We are entering into a new global economic paradigm. I mean, Professor Choi mentioned that the new normal. I think there are three keywords for policy priorities and future cooperation between the United States and Korea. It's the first one is inequality, and then fairness and rule-based system, and then technology. About 6 years ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., I participated in the KEI's university program. It was February, so it's cold, but they took me to South Dakota. How nice. I prepared my presentation, but then that morning, I had a chance to visit a local company, which is called Daktronics, which is making some scoreboard in the stadiums and video systems and LED signs. I was very, amazed by how it's a kind of the local, but they also export these products to Korea. So when all these the scoreboards I see in Korea are made in the South Dakota. I never been to. But then it was actually established by two University of South Dakota professors. They started about 50 years ago from a garage. So I had shared my concerns about the economic future of Korea. Why? Because in Korea there are no garages. But you know that all these the new startups and the ventures, Apple and Microsoft, all started out of garage. I think that we have a good common project to build the garages in Korea for the technology cooperation in the future. I'm sure that our third session we will talk about more in detail about the technology and so on. But I suggest that we should seriously consider this new project. Okay, here since in a perfect world, probably I should have had the presentation materials from these two speakers, but I didn't. But the Troy asked me to provide some the discussion materials. So I prepared as a discussion some of the PowerPoint. I don't know if that's that is on or not. If not, it's okay. There it is. So I just mentioned that some of the world economic the conditions slow down in GDP and trade, and there are some reasons. I just highlight that the reasons. One of the reasons is the protectionism, and it actually accelerated since 2012, according to the Global Trade Alert, because of the non-traditional trade barriers contributed to the slowdown of trade. Then there are some backgrounds of new protectionism. One of them is that before we actually had some growth that actually helped everybody. But according to IMF report in 2015, the benefits do not trickle down, which actually has some important implications for the rising inequality. And some of the economists actually take this issue and say that some disproportionate adverse effects of world trade expansion across the subgroups within a country. And then there are some anti-globalization, anti-trade sentiments that includes the political issues. Now, the Korean economy outlook is not so good, as you can see, and it involves some of the issues like the aging society problem. As you can see that on the left-hand side, it's in 2015. No Korea in the ranking. But by 2050, Korea is going to be number 2 country in terms of the aging population, right after the Japan. And then some other social problems with the suicide rates, and especially suicide rates for the elderly people. And as you know, Korea is education king, but the welfare expenditure is the rock bottom of the OECD countries. So Korea's strategy was to tackle some of these social problems using some economic policies and trade policies, such as FTAs. And so Korea's FTA policy actually has about 52 countries with the 15 FTAs. And evaluation says that with the right-hand side panel, the blue color is with the FTA GDP growth, and the red color is GDP growth without FTA. So it would have been worse than the now for Korea. So meaning that the FTA has been contributing to Korean economic growth. I'd like to talk a little bit about the KORUS FTA, the economic factors, market access, and the contribution to the production and trade, employment, and so on. But the next two, the consumer welfare and enhanced global competitiveness, had not been as much emphasized. And then one of the reasons why Korea pursued KORUS FTA was to for the advancement in economy-wide system upgrade, not the short-term economic gains. And then the geopolitical factors are there. But FTAs are not a panacea, especially with the currently changing economic environment and the international political environment. So there are some needs for the inclusive policies for sustainable economic growth, and that's one of the Korean government is government trade. I mean, some economic policies emphasizing the inclusiveness and also sustainable growth. And some of those the policies that are related to the trade include some trade-specific support programs for labor mobility. But I would like to emphasize this thing, the accumulating social capital towards the social integration. That's one of the key issues in Korea for the economic growth and the trade policies. And the keyword is trust building. It's not just for the Korean domestic economic policy, but probably the cooperation between the U.S. and Korea. We need this more trust building. And we need to prepare for the new era with the digital trade. And there's a need for the new paradigm for trade and economic policy. Of course, we should keep up with the market and competition, market economy and competition, and increase the fairness. And for that, we need the rules-based system. I mean, especially through the multilateral trading system and the global trading order. At the same time, new sets of the policies are needed to address some of those inequality issues, and also improvise some of those innovation with the new technology. So there are some cooperation beyond KORUS FTA. Of course, the technology and innovation, like I said, we should actually have some garage building project together. And recently Boeing is opening up the new R&D center in Seoul. In order to have some cooperation with Samsung or LG's R&D centers, I mean, we can see that the global value chain is working here. And then there are some need for satisfying, need for the rapidly changing labor demands. So some sort of the training and exchange programs among the scholars, students, business side as well, and some of those the education programs, and some of the startups and the self-employment with the new technology. Of course, the cooperation for the establishing rules-based global economy is very important, also touched by the Professor Che and the Joy. We need to have some reform in the WTO and the boost the multilateral trading system with the fair trade practices and enforcement, so that we can improve the transparency and predictability. Also, for the new technology and digital economy, we need to have some sort of the rules for the IPR and investment. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to David.
Thank you, Congressman. It's on. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to try to speak on behalf of the 63 member companies of the U.S. Korea Business Council and many of our other companies that work with the International Division of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to synthesize their viewpoints on some of the issues and comments that have been made this morning. I think we are almost largely in agreement with almost everything I've heard from my colleagues on the panel here. I would say that at the present time, a lot of our member companies kind of view that the U.S. engagement with Korea and with Asia is sort of in a period of stasis, of not moving ahead for a number of reasons. And particularly with Korea, some of these are concerns with the spillover of the U.S.-China trade dispute as having not just bilaterally, but with other countries, and particularly with Korea. And that's one thing that's been raised with me on many occasions, is that China is the largest export market for Korea and for many Korean companies. And to the extent trade is impacted with China, it also affects Korean exports to China. And similarly, it affects Korean exports to the United States, as Korea is a supplier of many intermediate components to the U.S. So this is not just a bilateral issue, but also I think affects the U.S.-Korea economic engagement. Also, I think since the conclusion of the signing of the KORUS amendments in March, that both countries have kind of turned their focus elsewhere. For Korea, obviously, engagement with the North has been the top priority. But as other speakers have mentioned, the launch of the new Southern policy for Korea is a major endeavor, which perhaps signals a turn away from the United States. And similarly, Korea's engagement on a multilateral level in Asia with RCEP and potential interest in CPTPP in the coming year, perhaps has diminished interest in taking advantage of the benefits of KORUS. And similarly for the U.S., with the intense focus on the renegotiation or the negotiation of the USMCA, and also potential negotiations with the EU and Japan next year, U.S. policymakers have also kind of refocused their attention. I was heartened to hear the prognostication of Vice Minister Lee regarding the passage of KORUS 2.0 by the National Assembly, or the ratification. Our membership consider this a top priority to get this period behind us so we can move on. Our members, or the U.S. Korea Business Council, has spoken out publicly that Korea should be exempted from the 232 investigation on autos. We believe that those issues had been negotiated in KORUS, and that treating whatever you think about the investigation, that as those issues have been resolved in KORUS, that treating a security ally like Korea in this way is not helpful. And also, I think in terms of, as Professor Che, I completely agree with his assessment, in terms of the passage by the National Assembly, it casts a shadow on that deliberation that really is unnecessary. Looking ahead, our members remain very optimistic and really want to go beyond KORUS 2.0 into a new era of cooperation with Korea. Some of the areas that have been mentioned, our membership completely agree with. The one that I would most emphasize is greater collaboration on digital economy issues that have been mentioned by Vice Minister Lee and Joy, and by Professor Che. We consider this a top priority for all of the reasons mentioned. In particular, the fact that the U.S. and Korea are really the two global technology leaders in many of the underlying technologies that enable the fourth industrial revolution and the digital economy. But there are still issues out there that every country is trying to deal with, and they're difficult issues. But we think the possibility for alignment between regulators and private sector practices between our two countries is great, and that it could agreement on issues such as cross-border data flows, how cloud computing capability is treated, how privacy is treated, that U.S. and Korea through collaborative groups, whether they be regulator to regulator or public and private together, hold the potential to create a standard that could be the model for elsewhere in Asia. We've heard about the Professor Che's analysis of the three potential models of digital trade. what concerns us most immediately without that kind of standard out there is the movement towards data localization legislation or regulation already taking place across Asia. Right now, our membership is focused on new data localization requirements in India, in Vietnam, in Thailand, and potentially in Indonesia. All, again, countries struggling with how to deal with the new technology and what this means for their own economies and for their own regulation of whether it be their banking system or domestic commerce or anti-corruption laws. And it's a big, real issue for many countries. But we think that for the U.S. and Korea, the possibility of sitting down and coming to some agreement on a number of aspects of this is great, and we would strongly encourage that. In other areas, we also agree with Joy's comments regarding regulatory reform. These in Korea, we also, our members consider this a high priority of trying to bring better, coherent, predictable, transparent, and inclusive processes to the formation of regulations in Korea. This has been an ongoing concern for a number of years for many of our companies, and we encourage the efforts of the Moon administration to continue their efforts. Thus far, I think they have really been lagging. But, you know, there is an OECD report that came out in May 2017 that kind of provides a detailed framework for assessing where Korea is at the present time. And we think continued dialogue there, whether it's government to government or, again, public or private, is something that will make the investment environment in Korea more attractive for American firms, because this is something that is raised with us quite often, is unpredictability in what regulations may come up, but also the cost. It raises cost of doing business, and for a lot of our companies, they find, and I've been informed, that a lot of their government affairs budget for all their Asia operations is spent in Korea. Some companies told me that 50% of their regional government affairs budget is spent in Korea trying to deal with uncertain regulatory prospects. So I think by addressing that, the investment environment improves. And also, I think for a lot of Korean companies, and particularly with startups, having a regulatory environment that is more inclusive could offer startups a better environment in Korea to build their businesses. We can give you examples that I've read about major Korean companies such as Naver moving its financial services, its fintech business to Japan. That SK Telecom launched its mobile healthcare service in China. That Samsung moved its headquarters for its mobile health division from Suwon to Silicon Valley, in part because the opportunity to grow elsewhere is there. And this is something that I think Korea can really benefit from in enabling its own startups to grow in Korea and create the kind of jobs that will really benefit the economy. And just to close on a couple of other topics, there are other areas where we believe, our members believe, that bilateral cooperation could be highly beneficial. In addition to the digital economy, one would be in the area of autonomous vehicles. Again, this is sort of a convergence between ICT regulation and the transportation sector. But obviously the U.S. and Korea firms are global leaders in both of those areas. And we believe that as this is a quickly evolving sector, where standards and are still being developed, not only for the vehicles themselves, but more importantly for the infrastructure that will support those systems. As that's developed, that the U.S. and Korea, again, are both well positioned to take a leadership position that, again, can be the standard in Asia and perhaps globally. The last area I'd like to comment on is, again, to agree with Professor Che's comments about greater cooperation between the U.S. and Korea on combating non-market economy practices. The U.S. is already engaged in this kind of dialogue with the EU and with Japan. And Korea, obviously, perhaps is more impacted by these practices than any other country. There are studies out. The U.S. Chamber has a report out on the Made in China 2025 policy. And in that report, actually, that Korean companies tend to be are projected to be the most adversely affected by Made in China 2025 policy that it actually becomes effective. So I think greater collaboration there would be helpful to Korea. Much of some of the industries where Korea has seen a decline, such as in steel and petrochemicals, in part is attributable to having to compete against state-owned and subsidized competition from neighboring countries. So I appreciate some of the comments that have been made. I think particularly on digital economy that our membership view that as progress there and engagement there as a top priority for public-private cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So to put this in perspective and really frame this up, we've heard a really thorough and terrific discussion of the priorities and the things that our two governments should be focusing on, with allusion to the broader problems facing the region and more broadly, globally, with regard to trade and investment. But I had an amusing thought as Joel was talking about all the innovation that's occurred with technology in garages here in the U.S. Perhaps we should put the senior political leaders in a garage, because what's needed is policy innovation. But I guess the question is, on one hand, we have this very robust economic relationship bilaterally between our two countries with a deep understanding of what needs to be done on our side, as well as President Moon, the need for regulatory reform and some harmonization there, the agreed upon rules and things that we have within KORUS. And then on the other hand, you have this articulation by the Korean government, the U.S., other governments in the region about visions of the Indo-Pacific, whether it's a Southern strategy and how to coordinate this. So the fundamental question is, how do you bridge the gap? What should we really focus on, given that the U.S. administration seems to be moving slowly, tentatively, wanting to stick to bilateral trade agreements and focused a lot on protection on one hand with the 232 tariffs and so forth. And on the other hand, this broad sweeping vision of how do we coordinate and create standards, high-level standards across the region that could be adopted, whether it's for digital trade or energy investment, infrastructure investment, the digital economy, and so forth. So my question, I guess, to start this would be, what should we really focus on to build out a more multilateral consensus? Should we look at specific sectors in investment and try to pinpoint things between our two governments and try to get broader collaboration with the others? Let me just put that out for the panel to make a few comments, and then we'll open up to the audience. Anybody want to go first? Dr. Choi?
Well, the reason I was proposing a so-called digital single initiative is because I thought other alternative is not going to be realistic. Well, we understand so much discrepancy between so-called mainstream economist point of view, how we can better manage global economic challenge and current U.S. administration approach. So any suggestion should be realistic. Having said that, I don't see any benefit of putting all these agendas together in broad-fashioned way. I think there's a waste of time. So the reason why we point out the economy is because this is a talk of town, and this is what is driving all the excitement, and where we don't have any agree upon multilateral framework. So I think this is a focal area of concern, and make it happen bilateral between core countries and create momentums and join some like-minded countries. I think final litmus test is at the end of the day whether or not we can bring on board some other, the huge local economy based on their own system. So I think this is instead of using unilateral approach, I think bilateral multiply possibly on a short period of time and create momentum, making tipping point and move on.
Thank you. David, just on that note, you talked about the priority for your membership with regard to digital trade. And I think obviously this is a huge driver of economic growth, technological development, so forth. Just thinking about how to jumpstart something, do you think perhaps if the U.S. and Korea were to get to agreement on a number of these issues, starting with KORUS and building on what needs to be done in the area of digital trade, do you think it would be a useful approach for Korea and the United States to then approach other like-minded countries, similar to, say, what was done with the Trade and Services Agreement, where this was an attempt by countries to come together to do something over and above the WTO commitments and obligations to create a framework for digital trade?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're dealing with that our discussions among our membership. I mean, one of the positive things that has happened recently is actually in the U.S. MCA agreement, Chapter 19 of that agreement on digital trade really is, we believe, is the most advanced digital trade chapter in any U.S. trade agreement, and maybe any agreement globally. So that is something that's something that we believe can be a model. And I don't have a consensus of all my companies, but I believe that we have very positive assessment of that chapter. And so as we look for models to build around, whether it's just a specific digital trade agreement bilaterally with other countries, we think that's a really good starting point, maybe a good ending point. And so, as we look to upcoming negotiations, with Japan, if the negotiation, is comprehensive enough to incorporate chapters like digital trade, we think that's a good inclusion. For Korea, again, we would encourage our Korean friends to take a good hard look at that chapter. There's an e-commerce chapter in KORUS, but it really doesn't go broad enough to just capture the rapid changes in technology. So a digital trade chapter, I think would make perfect sense for the two countries. And so that could be an easy starting point. We don't want to talk about amending KORUS again, but perhaps another mechanism to allow the two countries to move ahead in something that is mutually beneficial and would be the gold standard for the rest of Asia.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to take questions from the audience. Sir, if you stand up and maybe just state who you are. Yes, we have a mic coming.
Thank you. Mike Billington with Executive Intelligence Review. President Trump's video on North Korea, you probably remember, really emphasized that he was looking forward for U.S. investments in North Korea, supposedly in cooperation with South Korea. And I know Prime Minister Abe has talked about joint investments with South Korean companies in the North. So I'm wondering how all of you think about how to look forward towards bringing the U.S. into co-investments in the North Korea, perhaps also in the Russian Far East, which South Korea is very anxious to invest in, and even with China potentially on the Belt and Road projects that are now being looked forward to in Northeast China, Northeast Asia.
Thank you for the question. Anybody want to take that one on? Joy?
So I think it's important to plan, to have a vision, to have those kinds of discussions as to the event, in the event that North Korea gets to the point where it's denuclearized and is open and welcoming to foreign investment. I think it's great to plan. The caution that we're asking is that we're not there yet. And we've made it very clear to North Korea that they have this bright future if they choose it, but they have to denuclearize. And until that point, sanctions remain in place. And we're not lifting sanctions. This is something that the Korean government, our government, frankly, the international community has agreed on. So there's no harm in planning and having a vision, but as long as we understand that these are plans and we're not taking steps to actually do things with North Korea yet.
I agree with the Director Joe Yamamoto on that point of the we are not there yet. But if we get there, I would welcome the U.S. Participation in the investing in the infrastructure and the building up North Korea, because it's going to bring some more stability in the region, involving all the stakeholders, including the United States, of course the South Korea, but the Japan or China, Russia. So I'm sure that currently the some of those plans actually include the United States involvement. I can say that.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. Perhaps you touched on this. I got in a little bit late. But the OECD, of course, has released their latest comprehensive report on economy in Korea. And in fact, I think the author of that report spoke at KEI here in D.C. just a few months ago. And I understand that report raised some controversy in Korea. For instance, his suggestion that describing, as I saw it, the difficulty in the government to getting effective regulation on the large conglomerates, the chaebol. But for our Korean visitors, what's your reaction to that report? I mean, was that do you go along with much of what he said, or was he missing something?
Well, that is OECD Secretariat's report, and as you know, the OECD is a member-driven economy. Secretariat, they don't make any decisions. But nonetheless, OECD, they have consistently released all the report, all member economies, including South Korea's. I think the bone of contention is whether or not current administration, Korean administrations, their policy priority, so-called income-led growth, is sufficient enough, strong enough to reduce so much inequality and disparity. And I think the jury is still out there. And so that's the reason why current administration, they decide to adopt innovation-driven and inclusive growth. So I think that's partially they're recognizing some, the insufficient aspect of current policy orientations. I think what is happening in Korea right now is we having 3 tsunamis already, this very well-known tsunami. One is a so-called rapid aging, unprecedented speed in the world, which I call silver tsunami. And we don't have that much sufficient social safety net, unlike typical OECD northern European economies. The second one is technological tsunami, which I explained to you. Despite all these potentials, somehow due to so much, the burdensome regulation, we couldn't get free ourselves them together. So I was heartened by remark from my U.S. counterpart. They saying the Korean companies, they try to make growing opportunity outside Korea because of regulation. I think that is something provides some self-reflections. And third one is tsunami of geopolitics. So that's the reason why we are stretching so much importance of Korea-U.S. alliance in the regions. So with that sort of long-term orientations, I think we can reorient our policy toward that directions, and I think we can overcome challenges.
I might add a little bit. The Korean government right now pursues the income-led growth, economic growth, which faces some, the criticism in Korea. But at the same time, the Korean government is also trying to push for the fair economy, which is dealing with the jobs and some of the unfairness. At the same time, in order to complement this, the economic policy, it's also emphasizing innovation, innovative economy. And also jobs. So I think there are some, especially among these, the fair economy is actually one area where the current government has been emphasizing and also has been getting some outcomes and getting some support, more support from the people, I think.
That concludes our first panel. We've exceeded our time allotment, so please join me in thanking the panelists for this very terrific discussion.